Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me. It's true Texans appear as these super proud people, and so I was a little bit hesitant to name my talk Made in Texas, but I promise you that there's a pragmatic reason for it that I hopefully ties all of this together. So I have a project in the exhibition that Sila and Sim curated, bodybuilding, and what I wanted to do with this talk today is give the work a little bit of a context. So I will talk about work that is happening at the University of Texas at Austin. I will talk about the work that my practice is engaged in that also gives the work in the exhibition a little bit more of a background. And I will talk a little bit about field constructs, the competition that I think engages fabrication at the scale of the city in an interesting way. I also wanted to title the talk Made in Texas because actually the made in part is so integral to the history of fabrication. So the made in label, as most of you probably know already, actually emerged during in this symposium has been referred to as the Second Industrial Revolution. So towards the end of the 19th century, the British labeled German-made products made in Germany because at the time they were seen as inferior to English products. And so we all know labels that are attached to our clothing, to products that we consume. But I think that those labels really speak to the kind of circulation or mobility that fabricated products have. And I would argue that in the 19th century, these labels had to do with, let's say, nation building, but now I would argue that these concerns for circulation have to do with ecological concerns. So that's why it made sense. Now, at UT in Austin, the school itself, it's about 700 students, about 60 full-time faculty. We're quite pluralistic in the way that we view architecture and the allied disciplines. So about a week ago, what I did was I sent out an email to my colleagues, and I just said, if you self-identify as a person that does research in digital fabrication, please send me a couple of slides of your work. So this work is by Corey Beeg and the project Carat 6, which is a part of the TexFab exhibition and symposium, and then circulated to a number of different venues, including South by Southwest and a number of other design fairs. So as you could see, the concern of the work here has to do with certain formal and structural implications of a parametric system. Just recently, Corey and another one of our colleagues, Clay Odom, won an invited competition to design a semi-permanent installation at Florida International University on top of a Bernard Tschumi building. Both Corey and Clay went to Columbia, where Bernard Tschumi was the dean, and they both agreed that it's been their dream to design a hat for a building that their dean did. So they're working on that, and actually this is a project that is site-specific and quite large in scale, but we're prefabricating and assembling it in its entirety on our university campus beforehand. And so if that work is about structure and form, this work looks at, let's say, atmosphere and effect, so a couple of projects by Clay Odom. So looking at the digital as kind of material in and of itself, as light. This is Professor Danelle Briscoe's work that is kind of rethinking the typology of a green wall. So it's looking at fabrication in the context of landscape. And so even though it seems somewhat repetitive in pattern, the components are actually calibrated parametrically so that the containers for the planting provide self-shading. So in Austin, it's not uncommon to have a 100-degree Fahrenheit day, and with this parametrically determined self-shading system, it's possible to drop the temperature of the roots by about 30 degrees, which is quite significant. And this is a system that is 3D printed and currently in development. And again, looking at another project that comes from our cohort of professors and researchers, this is a project by Matt Ficus, who's kind of looking at fabrication in relation to program, let's say, and more conventional architectural practice. So that brings me to my work, and I always think that the best introduction to my work and its focus on fabrication in relation to materiality is this clip from the 1967 movie Graduate.
So I say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
Exactly how do you mean?
There's a great future in plastics. Think about it. Will you think about it?
Yes, I will.
Enough said. That's a deal.
Here he is now.
So Mr. McGuire tells the Ben character, played by Dustin Hoffman, in the late 60s, that the future is in plastics. And I would agree in many ways, and I would also say that there's a lot of work to be done with plastics in fabrication, with plastics in architecture. And so we'll look at a few projects that, that kind of deal with some of these questions. This project from about 5 years ago, bioluminescence, is an installation that looks at tensile surfaces that are so flexible in nature and that are digitally fabricated using the kind of liquid medium of cast rubber. And so the idea or the aim really was to produce a continuous surface that was also differentiated. So how can something begin as a sheet but also be three-dimensional in nature and also have depth? We had just at that point come out of this kind of prolonged moment with fabrication where everything was component-based, and so it was easy to cut and very difficult to assemble. And so we were really determined to cast and produce bigger sheets. And this is really where the issue of this question of like, where does material go? How does material move? How it came to be. So these are CNC cut shallow relief molds. And it's very interesting because the material, once it's poured into the mold, moves and goes exactly where the digital arm that cut it went before it. And so you can see some of the realized aspects of it. So again, it was dealing with this kind of medium of plastic. And I would say that plasticity it's a material property for sure, but I think it's also a property that is so native to the digital realm. And so plasticity as a kind of formal and performative quality, and then also a material quality. But then also what we discovered is that we can make our own plastics. So not only did we get to a point where we're trying to move toward more sustainable materials, like ones that don't force us to vacate our studio while we're casting because it gets to be too toxic in there, but that we could actually make biodegradable plastics from scratch using relatively available ingredients. And so this is really where we went from petroleum-based plastics to biodegradable plastics, and that's currently a focus of much of the kind of creative design research that we're doing in my studio and also in my teaching. So we've looked at a number of different polymers, biopolymers that are both vegetable-based and animal-based. So we're working with digitally produced pieces of formwork with biodegradable plastic that is cooked in our studio, and then figuring out what it really means. I mean, so on the one hand, the research is about the material itself. On the other hand, it's really about figuring out what it means for designers, what it means for architects not to just work with materials, but actually design materials. So if digital fabrication has allowed us to infinitely customize form, how might we work towards customizing materials in ways that are available to us in our studios? So the projects are, of course, very experimental in a way. This was an exhibition at Topps Gallery in Memphis, where really this idea of biodegradable plastic, something that could be composted very easily, even though it is stable, it's not like it will biodegrade in front of you. It's just to say that under the right circumstances, for example, if you bury it, that it would biodegrade in less than 6 months. But we really started looking at this kind of relationship between petroleum-based plastics and biodegradable plastics, and the exhibition was really a way to kind of, I guess, create a kind of a public experience that forces one to negotiate experiencing materiality in that way. So the white pieces are the formwork that the hanging piece was cast from, and then the hanging piece was eventually composted. And you can see some of the material properties. So we're always learning from through making, both digital making and material making. And so one of the themes of the exhibition was this kind of relationship between control and unruliness of materials. And I think it's always, or for us, it's been this adventure of figuring out the best balance between precision, or let's say diligence, and relaxation. But you can see some of the qualities that have emerged through these fabrication experiments. And hopefully you'll have a chance to see the piece in the exhibition as well, because it's very much a part of the same vocabulary. And then this is the project in the exhibition here in Tallinn that's really looking at this kind of model, which is not a representational model. So you're not looking at scaled models of buildings. It's a relational model, meaning that it's parametric in nature. So all the pieces are interrelated through computation, but also look at various life cycles of a material. So things that can be reused, recycled, composted. So really kind of looking toward this idea of an ecology of objects through the agency of materials. And then there's also the teaching part, so actually where materials come from and where they're going. This last spring, we established Edible Materials Lab, which is a super interesting initiative to look at material innovation for design in relation to food production. So the participants looked at everything from salt to algae, different gums, things that we would eat or things that we wouldn't eat but you could eat, but they're a part of food production. So biopolymers, minerals, and that research has yielded things like bioresin, coffee-based hardboard. So this is one of the things, there's actually a lot of coffee waste that it's not so easy to figure out what to do with it, mostly because it's so, a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's so dark. But you see on the left a sample, a prototype of a piece that's actually machined with a CNC router, so it's actually quite strong. And then on the right, a piece that was cast from digitally made formwork. This is sheeting made from microbial cellulose. So it's a material that's a byproduct of fermentation, made with a kind of a symbiotic colony of yeasts and bacteria. Biodegradable plastic foams that we're looking at right now. And then this is actually a biodegradable plastic made from agar. And so you see in this slide one of the kind of methodologies of kind of hands-on making and then in relation to digital design and fabrication. So this was a sample, and this was kind of observing how it cures over time, which at first was kind of daunting, because if you put it on a certain kind of surface, it develops these ridges, and then every single time it does this. So under the right circumstances, even though the material does its own thing, and this was also back when it was still molding because we didn't have the right additive for it, but then we were able to simulate that digitally, and so all of a sudden it becomes this kind of relationship between material behavior and kind of scripted properties. And so looking at that as a kind of system through aggregation. And then you see that as a prototype, which is about a meter in diameter. And then this kind of idea that kind of feedback from material to form can go back to digital fabrication via 3D printing. And so I will just end with this project. So we looked at the work at the University of Texas. We looked at the work of his studio, some of the teaching. And then finally, this is Field Constructs, the competition that I co-founded with a curator and a magazine editor. And the aim was really to create a venue for experimental work in architecture that actually had this kind of public agency as well. So we partnered up with a nonprofit organization that runs a site, a former landfill, which has been remediated, that is now a nature preserve. And so in many ways, these issues of materiality that have been driving my work and my research are kind of now cast in a much bigger, more public way through a competition as a way of supporting other emerging architects. So there are 4 winning entries that will be realized in November of this year. There is a project by Opal and Either Or. There's a project by Oda Plus. There's a project by Invivia, a team from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. I'm not going to talk about these too much because I think we're running out of time, but I will say that there are different ways to engage issues of fabrication in relation to the kind of the temporary nature of such architectural installations and in relation to site specificity. And then the final one is actually by Roland Snooks, who's one of the 4 winners who you will hear speak later this afternoon. But again, I think these issues of circulation in relation to fabrication are really interesting. They're interesting in material terms, also interesting in how architecture through fabrication gets to travel in different ways. So thank you.